So hello friends, in this video we are going to read chapter 5 of the book class 10th Civics. The chapter is titled as Popular Struggles and Movements. So let's start. First of all, overview. In the earlier chapters we discussed why power sharing is important in a democracy and how different tiers of government and various social groups share power. In this chapter, we will carry this discussion further and see how those who exercise power are constrained by the influence and pressure exerted on them. Democracy almost invariably involves conflict of interest and viewpoints. These differences are often expressed in organized ways. Those who are in power are required to balance these conflicting demands and pressures. We begin this chapter with a discussion of how struggles around conflicting demands and pressures shape democracy. This leads to an analysis of the different ways and organizations through which ordinary citizens can play a role in democracy. In this chapter, we look at the indirect ways of influencing politics through pressure groups and movements. This leads us in the next chapter to the direct ways of controlling political power in the form of political parties. So let's start. First of all, popular struggles in Nepal and Bolivia. Do you remember the story of the triumph of democracy in Poland? We studied it last year in the first chapter of class 9. The story reminded us about the role played by the people in the making of democracy. Let us read two recent stories of that kind and see how power is exercised in democracy. Movement for democracy in Nepal. Nepal witnessed an extraordinary popular movement in April 2006. The movement was aimed at restoring democracy. Nepal, you might recall, was one of the third wave countries that had won democracy in 1990. Although the king formally remained the head of the state, the real power was exercised by the popularly elected representatives. King Birendra, who had accepted this transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, was killed in a mysterious massacre of the royal family in 2001. King Gyanendra, the new king of Nepal, was not prepared to accept democratic rule. He took advantage of the weakness and unpopularity of the democratically elected government. In February 2005, the king dismissed the then prime minister and dissolved the popularly elected parliament. The movement of April 2006 was aimed at regaining popular control over the government from the king. All the major political parties in the parliament formed a seven-party alliance (SPA) and called for a 4-day strike in Kathmandu, the country's capital. This protest soon turned into an indefinite strike in which Maoist insurgents and various other organizations joined hands. People defied curfew and took to the streets. The security forces found themselves unable to take on more than 1 lakh people who gathered almost every day to demand restoration of democracy. The number of protesters reached between 3 and 5 lakhs on 21 April, and they served an ultimatum to the king. The leaders of the movement rejected the half-hearted consensus made by the king. They stuck to their demands for restoration of parliament, power to an all-party government, and a new constituent assembly. On 24 April 2006, the last day of the ultimatum, the king was forced to concede all the three demands. The SPA chose Girija Prasad Koirala as the new prime minister of the interim government. The restored parliament met and passed laws taking away most of the powers of the king. The SPA and the Maoists came to an understanding about how the new constituent assembly was going to be elected. This struggle came to be known as Nepal's second movement for democracy. The struggle of the Nepali people is a source of inspiration to Democrats all over the world. Have a look at the glossary. Maoist. Those communists who believe in the ideology of Mao, the leader of the Chinese Revolution. They seek to overthrow the government through an armed revolution so as to establish the rule of the peasants and workers. Now, Bolivia's water war. The story of Poland and that of Nepal apply to the struggle for establishing or restoring democracy. But the role of popular struggles does not come to an end with the establishment of democracy. People's successful struggle against privatization of water in Bolivia reminds us that popular struggles are integral to the working of democracy. Bolivia is a poor country in Latin America. The World Bank pressurized the government to give up its control of municipal water supply. The government sold these rights for the city of Cochabamba to a multinational company. The company immediately increased the price of water by 4 times. Many people received a monthly water bill of rupees 1,000 in a country where average income is around 5,000 a month. This led to a spontaneous popular protest. In January 2000, a new alliance of labor, human rights, and community leaders organized a successful 4 day general strike in the city. The government agreed to negotiate and the strike was called off. Yet nothing happened. The police resorted to brutal repression when the agitation was started again in February. Another strike followed in April and the government imposed martial law. But the power of the people forced the officials of the MNC to flee the city and made the government concede to all the demands of the protesters. The contract with the MNC was cancelled and water supply was restored to the municipality at old rates. This came to be known as Bolivia's water war. Now, democracy and popular struggles. These two stories are from very different contexts. The movement in Nepal was to establish democracy, while the struggle in Bolivia involved claims on an elected democratic government. The popular struggle in Bolivia was about one specific policy, while the struggle in Nepal was about the foundations of the country's politics. Both these struggles were successful, but their impact was at different levels. Despite these differences, both the stories share some elements which are relevant to the study of the past and the future of democracy. Both these are instances of political conflict that led to popular struggles. In both cases, the struggle involved mass mobilization, public demonstration of mass support clinched the dispute. Finally, both instances involved critical role of political organizations. If you recall the first chapter of class 9 textbook, this is how democracy has evolved all over the world. We can therefore draw a few conclusions from these examples. Number 1. Democracy evolves through popular struggles. It is possible that some significant decisions may take place through consensus and may not involve any conflict at all, but that would be an exception. Defining moments of democracy usually involve conflict between those groups who have exercised power and those who aspire for a share in power. These moments come when the country is going through transition to democracy, expansion of democracy, or deepening of democracy. Number 2. Democratic conflict is resolved through mass mobilization. Sometimes it is possible that the conflict is resolved by using the existing institutions like the parliament or the judiciary. But when there is a deep dispute, very often these institutions themselves get involved in the dispute. The resolution has to come from outside, from the people. Next, these conflicts and mobilizations are based on new political organizations. True, there is an element of a spontaneity in all such historic moments, but the spontaneous public participation becomes effective with the help of organized politics. There can be many agencies of organized politics. These include political parties, pressure groups, and movement groups. Now, mobilization and organizations. Let us go back to our two examples and look at the organizations that made these struggles successful. We noted that the call for indefinite strike was given by the SPA, or the Seven-Party Alliance in Nepal. This alliance included some big parties that had some members in the parliament, but the SPA was not the only organization behind this mass upsurge. The protest was joined by the Nepalese Communist Party Maoist, which did not believe in parliamentary democracy. This party was involved in an armed struggle against the Nepali government and had established its control over large parts of Nepal. The struggle involved many organizations other than political parties. All the major labor unions and their federations joined this movement. Many other organizations like the Organization of the Indigenous People, teachers, lawyers, and human rights groups extended support to the movement. The protest against water privatization in Bolivia was not led by any political party. It was led by an organization called FEDECOR. This organization comprised local professionals, including engineers and environmentalists. They were supported by a federation of farmers who relied on irrigation, the Confederation of Factory Workers Unions, middle-class students from the University of Cochabamba, and the city's growing population of homeless street children. The movement was supported by the Socialist Party. In 2006, this party came to power in Bolivia. From both these examples, we can see that in a democracy, several different kinds of organizations work behind any big struggle. These organizations play their role in two ways. One obvious way of influencing the decisions in a democracy is direct participation in competitive politics. This is done by creating parties, contesting elections, and forming governments. But every citizen does not participate so directly. They may not have the desire, the need, or the skills to take part in direct political activity other than voting. There are many indirect ways in which people can get movements to listen to their demands or their points of view. They could do so by forming an organization and undertaking activities to promote their interests or their viewpoints. These are called interest groups or pressure groups. Sometimes people decide to act together without forming organizations. Now, pressure groups and movements. Pressure groups and organizations that attempt to influence government policies, but unlike political parties, pressure groups do not aim to directly control or share political power. These organizations are formed when people with common occupation, interest, aspirations, or opinions come together in order to achieve a common objective. In the course of the discussion above, we came across entities that are not quite an organization. The struggle in Nepal was called a movement for democracy. We often hear the word people's movement to describe many forms of collective action. Narmada Bachao Andolan, movement for right to information, anti-liquor movement, women's movement, environmental movement. Like an interest group, a movement also attempts to influence politics rather than directly take part in electoral competition. But unlike the interest groups, movements have a loose organization. Their decision making is more informal and flexible. They depend much more on a spontaneous mass participation than an interest group. Now, sectional interest groups and public interest groups. Usually, interest groups seek to promote the interest of a particular section or group of society. Trade unions, business associations, or professional, lawyers, doctors, teachers, etc. bodies are some examples of this type. They are sectional because they represent a section of society: workers, employees, business persons, industrialists, followers of a religion, caste group, etc. Their principal concern is the betterment and well-being of their members, not society in general. Sometimes these organizations are not about representing the interest of one section of society. They represent some common or general interest that needs to be defended. The members of the organization may not be benefit from the cause that the organization represents. The Bolivian organization FEDECOR is an example of that kind of an organization. In the context of Nepal, we noted that the participation of human rights organizations. We read about these organizations in class 9. The second type of groups are called promotional groups or public interest groups. They promote collective rather than selective good. They aim to help groups other than their own members. For example, a group fighting against bonded labor fights not for itself but for those who are suffering under such bondage. In some instances, the members of a public interest group may undertake activity that benefits them as well as others too. For example, BAMCEF, Backward and Minority Communities Employees Federation, is an organization largely made up of government employees that campaigns against caste discrimination. It addresses the problems of its members who suffer discrimination, but its principal concern is with social justice and social equality for the entire society. Now, movement groups. As in the case of interest groups, the groups involved with movements also include a very wide variety. The various examples mentioned above already indicate a simple distinction. Most of the movements are issue-specific movements that seek to achieve a single objective within a limited time frame. Others are more general or generic movements that seek to achieve a broad goal in the very long term. The Nepalese movement for democracy arose with the specific objective of reversing the king's orders that led to suspension of democracy. In India, Narmada Bachao Andolan is a good example of this kind of movement. The movement started with the specific issue of the people displaced by the creation of Sardar Sarovar Dam on the Narmada River. Its objective was to stop the dam from being constructed. Gradually, it became a wider movement that questioned all such big dams and the model of development that required such dams. Movements of this kind tend to have a clear leadership and some organization, but their active life is usually short. These single issue movements can be contrasted with movements that are long term and involve more than one issue. The environmental movement and the women's movement are examples of such movements. There is no single organization that controls or guides such movements. Environmental movement is a label for a large number of organizations and issue-specific movements. All of these have separate organizations, independent leadership, and often different views on policy related matters. Yet all of these share a broad objective and have a similar approach. That is why they are called a movement. Sometimes these broad movements have a loose umbrella organization as well. For example, the National Alliance for People's Movements (NAPM) is an organization of organizations. Various movement groups struggling on a specific issues are constituents of this loose organization, which coordinates the activities of a large number of people's movements in our country. How do they influence politics? Pressure groups and movements exert influence on politics in a variety of ways. Number one, they try to gain public support and sympathy for their goals and their activities by carrying out information campaigns, organizing meetings, filing petitions, etc. Most of these groups try to influence the media into giving more attention to these issues. Number two, they often organize protest activity like strikes or disrupting government's programs, workers' organizations, employees' associations, and most of the movement groups often resort to these tactics in order to force the government to take note of their demands. Next, business groups often employ professional lobbyists or sponsor expensive advertisements. Some persons from pressure groups or movement groups may participate in official bodies and committees that offer advice to the government. While interest groups and movements do not directly engage in party politics, they seek to exert influence on political parties. Most of the movement groups take a political stance without being a party. They have political ideology and political position on major issues. The relationship between political parties and pressure groups can take different forms, some direct and others very indirect. Next, in some instances, the pressure groups are either formed or led by the leaders of political parties or act as extended arms of political parties. For example, most trade unions and students' organizations in India are either established by or affiliated to one or the other major political party. Most of the leaders of such pressure groups are usually activists and leaders of party. Next is sometimes political parties grow out of movements. For example, when the Assam movement led by students against the foreigners came to an end, it led to the formation of the Assam Gana Parishad. The roots of parties like the DMK and the AIADMK in Tamil Nadu can be traced to a long-drawn social reform movement during the 1930s and 1940s. Next, in most cases, the relationship between parties and interest or movement groups is not so direct. They often take positions that are opposed to each other, yet they are in dialogue and negotiation. Movement groups have raised new issues that have been taken up by political parties. Most of the new leadership of political parties comes from interest or movement groups. Now, is their influence healthy? It may initially appear that it is not healthy for groups that promote interest of one section to have influence in democracy. Our democracy must look after the interest of all, not just one section. Also, it may seem that these groups wield power without responsibility. Political parties have to face the people in elections, but these groups are not accountable to the people. Pressure groups and movements may not get their funds and support from the people. Sometimes pressure groups with small public support but lots of money can hijack public discussion in favor of their narrow agenda. On balance, however, pressure groups and movements have deepened democracy. Putting pressure on the rulers is not an unhealthy activity in a democracy as long as everyone gets this opportunity. Governments can often come under pressure from a small group of rich and powerful people. Public interest groups and movements perform a useful role of countering this undue influence and reminding the government of the needs and concerns of ordinary citizens. Even the sectional interest groups play a valuable role where different groups function actively. No one single group can achieve dominance over society. If one group brings pressure on government to make policies in its favor, another will bring counter pressure not to make policies in the way the first group desires. The government gets to hear about what different sections of the population want. This leads to a rough balance of power and accommodation of conflicting interests. So with this, our chapter ends, and in the next video, we will cover the next chapter. So till then, subscribe to the channel, listen to the audiobooks, and study well. Thank you.